Hi, I'm Tom Stevenson and welcome to Cost Control in Construction, Lecture 2A. This will be the first of two lectures in this component that we'll be looking at. So, the learning objectives for this particular lecture, or what we're trying to get across, is really come to grips with an understanding of the basic definition of cost control and some of the qualities of cost control, some of the things that it actually involves looking at before we dive deeper into this topic in future lectures. We also talk a little bit about how cost control accounts are used and who's involved in the process and why we have it there and some of the opportunities of learning from that. And of course, the importance of really coming to grips with a good sort of plan, a budget, a schedule, a baseline that we can measure from. And that's one of the key components of being able to set yourself up well for a cost control system. When we think about cost control, we can think about it being similar in a lot of ways to schedule control, and they kind of work together in a lot of ways as well. As I may have mentioned in 1B, Lecture 1B, you have to think about both time and money very often because they're interrelated. Very often, shortening a time will usually cost money. Something taking more time than you expected will usually cost more money. So there's this relationship that occurs in construction, depending on what's going on the construction project. And we also need to be able to get this information in a timely fashion. You know, it's hard to control cost if we're finding out what went wrong 3 months ago. So that means that we have to be pretty vigilant in updating our schedules and updating our costs so we can see what things are occurring without too much of a time delay. There's always going to be a little bit of a time delay, but the less that is, the more pertinent the information is, the quicker we can act upon it and get ourselves in a better position with it. Really, you have to think about project management as being an iterative process, that things are always changing. It's a moving process. It's a dynamic process. So that means that we have to see where we're at so we can make adjustments so that we can respond to whatever's occurring on our project and get ourselves back on track. Back on track means back on track, back on schedule, and back on budget. And to ensure that our budget doesn't keep going further and further and further out of control. Now, for the steps for project success that we have to think about when we combine both schedule and cost control, we have to think about the scope. What is involved in this project? What have we been contracted to do? And what are we responsible for? So in other words, what are we going to need to track as far as the activities and the costs? So that means that we have to develop a baseline, which is the plan. And that's everything that we know at that moment in time. So when we're starting the project, what do we know about the project? What is our experiences? What was our estimate, which then is going to be broken into our budget? What are the time constraints that we're working within? And we develop a plan known as our baseline, a baseline schedule and a baseline budget. And then what's going to happen is we're going to measure and document how we are doing. So basically, we have the baselines, and then as actual work proceeds, we're going to measure against that baseline. We're going to see, you know, are we ahead of schedule? Are we behind schedule? Are we over budget? Are we under budget? Etc. And we're going to be also looking for trends, things that might be problematic. So, for example, if we're doing a 30-story condominium building and we're taking 7 days to do each floor instead of 5 days, and of course, if we have the resources that we plan, that would be adding a lot of extra costs. Then how much over budget are we on this one floor? And then if we continue this trend, how much over budget and how much delayed will the project be if we do another 29 floors, if we go at this pace? So those are giving us sort of warning bells to act sooner rather than later. And we can, review, analyze what's exactly going on. We can sort of go from a sort of a higher level down more granular, depending on how we've broken down the baselines, because that really gives us the material that we can measure against. Now, of course, we're not just going to sit on it if we're seeing that we're going to be, one floor we're 2 days behind, but by the end we'd be 60 days behind, and maybe one floor we're 10,000 over budget, and then another 29 floors we'd be 300,000 over budget by the time we're done, whatever it may be. So we'd act upon that. Those numbers would give us feedback that we could start to see, well, what's going on? Why is it taking longer? Why are we not being as productive as we planned? So you want to really then execute and redevelop the plan, recovery. So that would be our recovery plan to get us back on track. And that's step by step. So it's an iterative process, because as soon as we do that and we start acting on that, something else starts to take us off track. But by constantly measuring against what we planned, then we can make adjustments, and that'll help us reach our area of expertise or success that we're looking for. So as I was saying, no project goes exactly as we planned. It's iterative. If anybody's ever telling you, oh, we've developed a plan, then we execute, and then it goes exactly as planned, good luck. If it's got any kind of level of complexity, there's going to be things going on. We talked about the tool in the last lecture, 1B, of VUCA, and volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. These are all things that come into play that perhaps take us away from our plan and causes some issues with our ability to keep to the plan. So we have to be able to measure and see what's impacting it, and then make adjustments so that we can bring ourselves back on track. And that really is what goes on with project management. Some of the principles that we have to think about, the type of contract that we have, it may impact the type of reporting we do, but it does not negate that we need to do cost control of some way, shape, or form. So if it's a lump sum project, so a stipulated sum project, most common type of project, although getting to be less common than it used to be for sure. We're really wanting to make sure that we're keeping the controls on our costs for our own purposes, right? So that we can come under budget, we can make the profit targets that we set out for, we can cover our overhead for the company and be sustainable as a business. If it's a cost plus, it may be that we're doing it so that we can also be, if we're audited by the client or the customer, that we have everything clear, we can show basically where the costs are, etc. And then we can do our markups and our profit add-ons based on our contracts. It all depends on the type of contract and what we're responsible for, but nevertheless, you have to be able to monitor the costs. And indeed, in some cases, you have to be really, really detailed in that updating process, because it may be very, very closely reviewed, as we'll learn in later lectures. So really, three key participants. There's a lot of actually participants in your projects, and it depends what level of contract that we're talking about. So right now, a little bit higher level, you may have the GC, you may have the owner and the designer, or you may even have a developer and you might have a GC. It can have all kinds of different organization to it, and there's different responsibilities depending on the type of contract, as I mentioned, how those costs are going to be broken up and how they're going to be reviewed. But definitely at the higher level, we have that. Of course, at the next level down, we're going to have general contractors and suppliers and subcontractors. And then subcontractors are also going to be involved in their own cost control. So different levels in the structure and in the reporting structure. So when we think about all the different and various parties involved in a building project, who do you think is primarily responsible or concerned with cost control? So it's a question, but I don't know if that's detailed enough, because when you think about it, everybody's going to need to be involved, right? So if you take this sort of outline here and we look at it and the relationships between the parties, we definitely have the owner up above. They may have contracted with the architect, and they may have their own consultants that they contracted with, but they're definitely going to be concerned about their own costs. The architect may be very concerned about any consultants that they hired, if they did like some sort of cost plus kind of relationship with one of them. They want to make sure that whatever they're charging them makes sense, and they'll want to monitor that. If it's a lump sum, the consultants definitely want to be careful that it's not costing them more than they estimated. And then the same thing over here on the contractor side. Well, they have subcontractors, and they want to make sure that the subcontractors are not overbilling in any ways, that changes and claims are being settled, and disputes are being clarified and settled into change orders, which then, that of course would change the relationship between the contractor and the owner. So the contract amount may change, or it may delay the project, or both. So these are all some of these interconnections that take place. But obviously the owner, they want to meet their project requirements and budgets. Consultants, they have their budget frameworks to work within. One reason why information beyond what was designed is often difficult to get. You know, maybe they were only given a certain scope, and things that you're trying to get from them are outside their scope. So that can be sometimes problematic when the actual problem is with the contract between the owner and architect. Subconsultants, as I mentioned, that relationship. And of course, the subcontractors, they've got their own concerns, because most subcontractors self-perform the work themselves. And so that means they have a lot of employees, tradespeople, and trades are a variable cost. And so if something's taking more hours, then that's going to be costing them a lot more than perhaps they estimated. Conversely, if it's under, that's going to be a bonus for them. And contractors, as I mentioned, you know, they may or may not self-perform some of the work, as I mentioned in an upcoming slide. So that also depends. They may have variable costs. They may have a number of fixed costs, with fixed cost contracts with different suppliers and subcontractors. And so they need to ensure that they meet their budget requirements, so that their overall costs are meeting what the contract that they signed off with the owner. So you see how you have all these different levels that are working at different levels for their own purposes, but also they have contractual obligations that they have to satisfy. So when we think about it, in the budget really starts with the estimate. What was the estimate to get this project, and how did we procure the project? And then we want to break that down into stuff that we can actually track. The estimate might have been set up in a certain way, but it may have to be adjusted so that it's more trackable as far as the framework of how the project is going to be constructed. So we have our direct project costs, which would include labor, materials, the administration of managing the project. We talked a bit about contingency reserve for things that the known unknowns that are maybe involved in the project, that we can maybe contract for extras and claims, so then that's not going to affect the contingency reserve in that way. But there may be things that we missed, right? And so or that we kind of know, but the way the contract is worded, we're responsible for. And then we have, as a business, we always have overhead. And overhead is everything that's not part of the direct project. It's the head office. It's the admin people back at head office. It's payroll. It's estimators doing all the estimates that you never get on a project. That all rolls into your overhead. It's the cell phones that everybody has, the trucks and vehicles that people are driving around to different projects and different things on. These are all part of our overhead costs, because these things, you have to pay a fairly large amount of money, and they depreciate to nothing over a period of time. So you want, as a business, you want to make sure that those overhead costs are being accounted for. And then there's a certain profit target. What is the profit that you're trying to achieve? Is it 4%, 8%, 10%? What is the risk level based on the contract type? Some contracts have higher risk levels than other contracts, like a lump sum has a fairly high risk level. because you own it. Cost plus, a little bit different risk level. Construction management, not at risk, different risk directive. So we can think about it from those purposes. And of course, if we have the budget assigned to the project, then once we start, we can compare as we're going. So we can see as the project proceeds how we're doing. And to really think about the responsibility further, we've got to realize that the different parties are going to focus on cost control a little bit different at the different levels, right? The developer is probably going to be a little bit higher level. They're going to be worried about sections of work. They're going to be worried about the time frame that the project is going to take, because that would also affect them, especially if they're financing the project and they're leveraging it. Then that means that the longer the project takes, they've got to be paying out interest during that time period. And very often construction loans are a little bit more risky to investors, so they carry a little bit of a higher price premium, especially construction loans, as opposed to mortgages like on land or property, which is a little bit more stable than the construction portion. The constructor may or may not self-perform, as I mentioned, some of the work, but they're going to have much more detail, right? They're going to have, if they're self-performing some of the work, they're going to have, well, very detailed hours and labor hours and material breakdowns for their components. Let's say it's the forming and concrete work that they self-perform on a project. And then, of course, they're going to subcontract others, which would be on fixed contracts that they would have, plumbing, electrical, HVAC. And so they'll generally have that broken down at a higher level, but they're not going to have that broken down at a level that a subcontractor would have for that specific area of work. The subcontractor has to be looking at their hours, their labor hours that it's going to take, and that's a variable cost, and the materials that they're procuring and purchasing in this process. So different levels are looking at things in different ways. And so that means the information and how it's reviewed and how it's gathered will be different. So really, when we think about some of the principles of cost control, we want to make sure that we have everyone's engagement in this process. And we'll talk about lean construction in some future lectures, but a big part of it is trying to get the parties involved, engaged in the process. And we can be, when it really comes down to improvements, if we see that we're moving off track, we see that we have cost controls, all of us are smarter than one of us. So if we're actually collaborating on a project, that's where we can really help ourselves with cost control. And we'll talk about that in another lecture. So an example of that in lean construction would be, well, the 8 areas of waste. The last planner system, those would be 2. Pull planning, that would be another one, in allowing us to more effectively run our projects. And a lot of those elements at their core is trying to get better engagement and collaboration with the people on the construction project, something that's been sorely lacking in traditional methodology and sort of this me versus them sort of attitude of really sort of executing on projects. Not the best way to add value to clients, right? Not the best way to add value to clients. And we'll talk about in lecture 2B a little bit about Pareto's Law, but Pareto's Law, the 20/80 rule, really, if you can add value to clients, then that really means that that client's going to be satisfied at the end of the day, and they're going to want to do business with you in the future. And if you want to be a profitable business, that all leads down that road. And the other thing is, if we reduce waste and we are more on track, then we are much more likely to be profitable. So engagement of the people involved, if we're just looking at our own company, then we'd be looking at the project manager, the site superintendent, the foreman, the estimator, especially if we're self-performing the work. And of course, when we're awarding contracts and we're procuring the work, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page and get our engagement, and there's alignment right from the get-go. So pre-award meetings are very important to actually go line by line through the responsibilities with the trade and ensure that there's no misunderstandings, scope gaps, exclusions that weren't clarified, because that's your best opportunity as we talked about in lecture 1B, your best opportunity to save money is early in the project. So as soon as I am contracting with a subcontractor, before I've actually signed off on the contract, that is our best opportunity. If there's some issues or things that aren't really clear, or they think that they don't have to do something when we expect that they do, that's a very fundamental opportunity. And also we can engage them in basically inputs and ideas that will help us as the project evolves, right? So for all of those reasons. If a general contractor subs tender is accepted, their accounting department's now going to get their estimate, and basically the site team is going to develop a breakdown for the cost in the budget, right? So from estimating to the accounting to a discussion on the breakdown of the budget, reviewing the budget, making sure that it's in a manageable format is important. And so the level of detail and requirements, that will depend on company to company. That will depend on the level, as I just mentioned, subcontractor, contractor, developer, that sort of thing, depending on the project type. And when we think about accounting departments too, they need different types of information than necessarily we also need on the project, because when we're on the site team knows a lot more about how this project is going to be executed typically than an accounting department does. So we also have to think too, from a construction company point of view, we are impacted by VUCA, and there is a certain amount of risk in estimates. Particularly, that's why I was mentioning the self-performing part of the work. When we talk about labor costs, that's particularly more variable, and it can be directly impacted by events like volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Manufacturing, it tends to be less impacted because there's more of a steady stream of work. There's less, it's not project-based, right? We're project-based, where we got teams of people coming together to work on something, and they're not impacted by the weather the way that we are. That doesn't mean they're not impacted. They certainly can be impacted, especially when it comes to quality issues, recalls, all of these other things that can go on in manufacturing, right? Construction has the same in many ways, but has more things than just manufacturing does, is my point. So as I was mentioning with accountants, accountants are very good like at telling, when you've got an accounting system and you've got a cost control system and the gathering of data and inputting the information, they're very good at seeing that this project is losing money at a higher level, but really breaking down when you see in this particular area it's losing money. Why is it losing money in that particular area? Not so good. That's really where the site team comes in. Site supers, foremen, they can be really helpful in this engagement of this process of on-site, what is going on? Why is this losing money? Accounting department, accountants, management accountants can give a good framework of, well, this area is losing money, so what's going on? And then that can be asking the question that gets dug deeper and deeper on the project. So there's kind of that separation that occurs on larger projects I'm talking about. Smaller projects, the company owner, and they may be also managing the project, basically the chief cook and bottle washer, so they have a lot of responsibilities, and but they don't have, they're really relying on an accountant at the end of the year for tax purposes, not for necessarily monitoring the individual aspects of the project. They have to do that, the owners, small businesses, right? So that's really the difference between that. And we have to think, how are we doing at a high level? Are we meeting our project targets? And so the project targets, going back to what we just said, you have the overall cost structure for the project, what you're trying to achieve, and that's ensuring that you cover the overhead, you cover the profit margin you want, and you've made sure that you're able to build it for the budget amount that you've estimated, right? And if you don't, then the first thing that gets wiped away is your profit. So anything that costs more in your direct costs takes away from your profit. Your overhead you're stuck with. You got to pay for the office, you got to pay for the trucks, and etc. And by the way, you've got to get enough work in the year to cover whatever you've marked up your project for overhead. So, if you have $200,000 a year in overhead, then you have to make sure that you have enough projects that you put a high enough percentage that you complete in that year to cover that amount in your overhead. So if you don't market yourself and procure those projects that covers that, you're still going to be in trouble. So that's from a high level business point of view. But your direct estimate cost to build the project better be sound, because you marked up your project on it's based on the overhead, meeting the overhead requirements as a percentage, and your profit targets for that. So whenever you miss that, first thing that goes is your profit. And of course, as I said, PM, site super, estimator, field staff, they're concerned with actually getting the project built. And that's why you want to break the project down into smaller and smaller components so that it can be tracked and monitored as you go. When you start thinking about all this stuff, a lot of things in different fields, they're interrelated, right? You've got a goal. You want to do something in the next 2 years. Well, that's great. So that's the high level goal. Then you got to break it down into smaller components, right? Like if I want to get this done in 2 years, what do I have to do in the next year? If I want to really meet this 2-year target, and this is what I got to do in the next year, what do I have to do in the next quarter? If I have to do this in the next quarter to meet the target for the year, to meet the target for 2 years, what do I have to do in the next month, and in the next week, and in the next day, today? Well, it's not that different in construction. Same idea. I've got this project. It's going to take 2 years to construct. That's fine. So we got to have a work breakdown structure. These are the elements of the project and how we've broken it down. And then within that work breakdown structure, what do we have to do, right? And what time frame is that? All right, so the substructure we've got to do in the next 6 months to meet what we plan to get done in the 2 years for the whole project. Well, if we've got to do that in the next 6 months, what do we have to do in the next 3 months? Got to do this in the next 3 months. What do we got to do in the next month, the next week, the next day, today? So this is basically how we break things down. If we've got things broken down to enough detail that we can monitor the costs, then that's going to give us valuable feedback so we can see how we're progressing as we go. I don't want to wait till we're 2 months from the end and I suddenly realize, I get this epiphany that we're no way are we going to be able to finish the project. Not going to have a happy client, and that's not going to be a good way to manage your projects, and also motivate your people to actually complete the project. So we have to have a good idea where we stand based on time and based on money going into it. So going back to what I said earlier, that's where it ties to the baseline. So cost breakdown, we list the items associated with quantities measured and the costs recorded. The estimates got that collective amount. And as I mentioned, we can break down the items also so that we can manage it, right? If we're self-performing the work, we can monitor the labor, the hours of work. Materials, that's a little bit easier to monitor. We can monitor that. What did we plan for? What did we order? What was the estimate, or what was the supplier amounts for that? And what does the actuals compared to the estimate? Same with equipment. If we're renting equipment, how many hours, how many days, how many weeks did we take to use the equipment? What was it used on? And of course, making sure that we have all of our subcontracts all procured and that we've got them. How are they matching up with our estimates that we had for those particular subcontracts? So that's really where the estimate is the original that allowed us to get the project, and then we are going to transfer it over into a budget, and we're going to have a work breakdown structure so that we can attach costs to that so that we can manage those costs from it, and we can get granular as we need to do. We will apply some sort of coding system to the line items that we've broken down so that we can assign these items to various codes that we can track on the project. So if we know, for example, that we've got a certain code for this area of work, then within that area of work, we can have it broken down by labor, by materials, by other particular items that we are tracking, equipment. Okay, so there's different coding systems. My best way of explaining it is that probably, you know, whatever coding system I would say, probably your company's going to use a different coding system. There's quite a few different coding systems out there. The important thing is that you're able to track particular items, and it's in a consistent way held within a company format. It's one of the reasons master format is a logical choice. It follows the master format specifications as far as coding for particular items, so you know where they allocate to. But again, a lot of firms develop their own unique coding systems, especially like subcontractors, etc., will have that. So, you know, this is using sort of the master format and sort of just line items that way. And then, of course, with material, labor, equipment, subcontractor, overhead, you can have different formats within that you can utilize. And we'll look at that a little bit more detail in another lecture. All right, but really, coding does have to begin with the labor information. If we're talking about monitoring labor, if you have your own forces, you're going to want to have some sort of methodology of tracking their time. You know, every time somebody works on your site, one of your employees, how many hours were they working, and on what particular area of work were they working? So they worked 8-hour days, is it? And so then what were they working on? Is there a cost code that you can assign to that work? So now you know, well, we expected the footings to take this much. This is the cost code for it, this many hours of work. And when we tally all the work that was done on that, it's more or it's less than that. So we're over budget or we're under budget with that. And usually on smaller projects, as I was kind of mentioning, the super is usually responsible for making sure that the labor is properly coded. And on larger projects, you know, you're talking about cost engineers, somebody that's assigned to that particular topic. You're monitoring a lot of people, right? So it takes a lot of time and effort, but it's time well spent because it helps to give you the data that you need so that you can constantly iterate and make sure that you're effectively managing the project. You might say, oh, somebody's got to manage that. That's taking a lot of time. That's a cost unto itself, which it is. But the savings that can be brought about that when you're talking about necessarily literally hundreds of people working on a particular site can be quite dramatic. And the losses can be quite dramatic too if you're just not monitoring it. You won't know there's a problem till you see this huge shortfall in cash flow. Of course, labor is the trickiest to monitor, right? Because it's a variable cost. The other thing is, if you're trying to do cost loading and monitoring of productivity and labor with trades that you've got on a lump sum contract, that's extremely difficult. If you're self-performing the work, it's relatively easy, and then you can monitor those trades based on the prices that they gave you. But if you're those trades, you do want to monitor your people, and then it's just, now, what are they taking? How many employees? What did we allow for this? It's exactly the same thing as a GC monitoring something they self-performed for that trade. So that's gives you a little bit of idea of some of the principles of cost control that I just wanted to introduce in this lecture. And we'll be moving on to lecture 2B shortly. Thanks, everyone, and everybody have a wonderful day. Tom Stevenson signing off. See you on the next lecture. Bye for now.